I can't believe we failed.
Actually, I totally can. We're homeowners. What do you expect? So if you've been following us for a while, you probably remember a video we did kind of pointing out some of the things that the electrician who's been consulting with us saw that we needed to get fixed. We fixed them. We kind of took an afternoon and worked together and we knocked them all out. And basically, as far as we knew, that put us ready for our first electrical inspection. And we were right, but we were kind of wrong. So in a nutshell, the inspector came, we walked through the house. It was a very good conversation. Everything went really good. And I'll say that the person who's been helping us or guiding us nailed it. They were dead on. In fact, the inspector was quite impressed with the level of detail, the awareness of wire sizes, outlets, GFI protection, securing the wire, kind of all of that stuff. It's very atypical for a homeowner to even know about this stuff. And so the inspector very much took an advisor role, not like a judge with a hammer role, and walked through the system, the wiring, and all that. If you haven't been following us for a while, jump back a few videos. We've basically been working on trying to get a small living area usable in our garage, meaning heat, hot water, lights, and a few outlets, a bathroom working. We've got a washer, a range, and a refrigerator wired in, so it's kind of like a one-bedroom apartment.
So basically, there's no need to finish the rest of the house.
We're done, all done. We do need to put some siding on once in a while. Anyway, so that's kind of where we're at. We've been through the first inspection. Where we're located in Idaho, homeowners are allowed to pull their own permits and we can do our own work. The thing is, during the inspection, some new things came to light that the folks who've been consulting with us didn't tell us about. But in their defense, they really wouldn't have known per se because they wouldn't be doing what we're doing, which is what's called like a partial rough-in and living here. So let's maybe kind of back up and share with you what we failed on. So the first and probably the most expensive and the biggest eye-opening change that we have to do is basically most of these breakers have to go. And this was totally new information to me. I'd never even heard of this, even in passing conversation. And even the electricians who've been guiding us said, huh? And that's not because the inspector's wrong. It's just not something that electricians probably would run into. So with anything in this panel that's not already protected by a GFI device, the breaker itself must be a GFI. For example, our bathroom and the laundry are already protected by GFI breakers, and so are these outlets down here. So there's no need to change them. Whereas all of these breakers need to be GFI protected because they're temporary. That's the key. If you're going to live in a dwelling, you're going to need temporary breakers because they need to be protected against ground fault. And it's expensive. And so we're gonna have to switch out most of the stuff in this panel. Second thing, and this is more forward looking to the final inspection, anything that does not have some other means of disconnect. For example, the oven, it's got a cord, right? You can unplug the cord, but the water heater does not have a cord. So these breakers, because they're not within line of sight and they do not have some other alternate means of disconnect, these actually have to have a lockout installed on them so that if you're working on this device, you can both flip the breaker and put a lock on it so that in someone's innocence, they don't come by and flip the breaker on while the appliance is being operated. In sitting here thinking about this, I just realized that I made another mistake. We had to travel quite a long distance to get these GFI breakers. I'll show you those in a minute. They're a pretty interesting device. And when I bought those, I totally confused the need for lockouts with the need for GFIs. So in my mistake, I purchased a GFI for these three, the garage heat and the garage bath heat. What we really needed was one for the dryer and the range also. So in my error, we're missing these two breakers. We'll need to get those before we will be able to pass an inspection. Everything went really good with the water heater. The inspection went well all the way down to the box. And there's something I learned about boxes that I didn't know, and the electrician wouldn't have caught because we didn't disassemble this box. and that is that anything metallic has to be bonded or attached to the ground wire. So there are 3 ground wires coming in from these cables from the panel into this box, and then they're wire nutted, and then there's a single ground wire coming up to the water heater. But this box doesn't have a ground attached to it. And in theory, because this is body grounded and this conduit is attached to this box, in theory, it's grounded that way. But if you were to disconnect this, then the box would not be grounded. So we actually need to get a ground into this box and get it attached to those ground wires. We were trying to be super neat and tidy with our wiring, whatever that means from a homeowner perspective. And we did some finagling here. We actually changed this wire to a 12-3. It was a 14-3. And because it's a 20 amp circuit, all the wire on the circuit has to be number 12 wire. Well, when we did that, this wire kind of looked, out of place. And so I actually fastened it to this stud to the side. The problem is it doesn't meet code because any of these wires have to be fastened or secured within 12 inches of the box. It was over here, but when I moved it over there, suddenly it fails. So in trying to be neat and tidy, we actually failed the code, which requires Romexes and things to be secured within a certain distance of the box. And that conversation continues over here with the ICF. We were under the impression, by talking to the electrician, that the Romex being pushed back into the ICF would meet the code requirement for securing the wire. And the inspector said, no, not so much. So we've got to apply a securing method to these Romexes within the box and then every 4.5 feet, as well as the number 6 wire that's feeding the range. And we found a way to do that. This little box where the range plugs in is a shallow box, but it's got number 6 wire coming into it for this 50 amp range outlet. And it's just too shallow to get the outlet into. So I put this metallic box extension so that it would fit, which works, except for it's not grounded. So we either have to drill and tap a hole into this box and attach it by a pigtail to the grounding lug, or we're gonna have to replace that box completely with maybe a metallic box, and that way we can ground the entire box. And then there's the generator interlock. So we had to put labels on that, and it's not something that I was aware of, but it makes sense. The National Electrical Code has just a couple of subsections that require a label at the main service disconnect, and then another label where the input comes in. And I think we've got the language correct on those labels. We'll find out when we have our follow-up inspection. It did take some research. It's a little confusing when you look at how the code is written. Unless you're an electrician, you would understand the language, whether you're having a non-derived system or a derived system. Long story short, if you're not sure, either read the code very carefully or maybe consult an electrician if you're doing something like that. I think we've got the right label on our panel now. Apparently, this type of device is just really rare. If you try to buy something from just a regular electrical supply house, they're probably not going to have this. We had to go to the big city to find these. Part of it is that not every supply house carries every brand of equipment or every line. So we had to find somebody who carries the Siemens line because we have a Siemens panel. And then we had to find somebody who actually stocks a GFI version of these outlets. So this outlet is the same 40 amp 2-pole breaker. If I said outlet, I meant breaker. This breaker is the same as the breaker that's in the panel, but it has this huge addition to it that performs a ground fault interrupt function. So from what I can understand, we've got to attach this pigtail to the neutral bus, and then we attach our hots in here. And what's confusing a little bit, and the inspector has assured me he's going to kind of demonstrate or explain to me why this works. This breaker, and most of these breakers, are not going to actually have a neutral load because the device that we're hooking them to doesn't have a load neutral. But he assures me that it's still going to work. Hopefully he can explain all that and it'll all make sense. So I think one of these breakers, if you were to buy it without the GFI function, will probably run you $25, $30. And with the GFI function, closer to $100 or maybe even more if they won't give you some kind of a contractor discount. And what's important is that they have a test button and that the test actually works correctly. This isn't a great example, but this is a regular 20 amp single pole breaker. It's fairly compact. If you can kind of visualize, it's about half of one of these or so. So you can see that the GFI breaker is considerably larger. I'm wondering how that's going to affect us when we get into the panel and start stacking these on top of each other. I think it's going to start getting pretty crowded pretty quickly. We also found out about these breaker lockouts. I didn't even know this was a residential requirement. If you've worked in any kind of a commercial environment, lockouts are extremely common when you're working on any type of equipment that has an energy source. So now these types of devices are being required in residential. I think one of the things that's really frustrating for Alyssa and I is that we, in good intentions, stockpiled a lot of this equipment when we were just looking at yard sales or estate sales or found materials. We were picking it up and storing it. We've been storing a lot of this stuff for 3 years, waiting for this day. Here we are, and none of it is of any use because the code has changed and we just can't use any of it. We are finding use for it because there are people who can use it, but just not us, not with new construction, and maybe not even in residential. So this small lockout installs in the panel behind this breaker, and this lockout device just comes off. And then when you want to lock something out, you simply add the lockout and you add your padlock here, and now that device is de-energized until you remove your lock. Another product that I hadn't run into before was a zip tie with a screw hole on the end of it, but we ran into them at the electrical supply house, and this is what we think we're going to be using to secure the wire that's nested into the ICF. We wanted to have our electrical re-inspected promptly so that we can get a pass. Part of the thing that we're trying to achieve with this kind of portion of the project is making sure that we're doing it right. We're not trying to build the house to meet code. We're trying to build it as best as we can, which is all relative given that we don't have really any experience to speak of. We want to get through these inspections because it lets us know that we're on the right track, and we don't want to keep building if we're not doing it correctly and have lots of issues down the road. One small example of that the inspector pointed out to us was these lockouts. He said he likes to have conversations with homeowners before they really start. That way they don't get down the road and find out maybe toward final that they've made a big mistake. Another example was outlets. The code has changed, and tamper-resistant outlets are now code for new construction. So even though we have buckets and buckets and buckets of outlets, we can't use any of them. Really sucks. But we're glad that we knew about that before we started. That way we don't have to go back through the whole entire house and wire in all new outlets. Perhaps if we would have had a conversation earlier with the inspector, he would have told us about these GFI breakers, which would have saved us from purchasing the ones we have in there now, and of course the time and effort to install these at this point in time. We found these little pigtails with a ground screw, which is green, already installed on them at the electrical supply. I didn't realize it makes sense, but this ground screw must be green and just saves you a little bit of time making a pigtail. So may not be practical for everything, but sure was nice for this application. So I don't think we're even gonna need this little pretty cover plate.
We'll have a metal one, right?
Yeah, because the metal one is
And
the
no
cover
one will
plate.
see it.
So this box is a mess. We talked about lots of different ways of dealing with this. We don't seem to have a 1032 tap, or we do. I'm just not sure where it is. And it's not like this is really a great solution anyway. We picked up a couple of different boxes just in case we wanted to go this route, and I think we're gonna try this. This is a 2 1/4 inch deep EMT box. We can drill through the back of the foam into the concrete, and we can lag this box into the concrete. It'll be a lot more shallow than this contraption here. And then this, it's not really a mud ring, but cover plate, I'm not sure what you want to call it. It goes on the front of the box, and then the outlet mounts to that. Although you're still gonna need some sort of, oh, no, there's a different plate. We got a plate that's actually for the 50 amp, I remember that now. So this is not the plate that we'll use. We actually got one that's cut perfectly for this, that matches that. The goal is actually to get this thing to sit a little bit more flush to the wall so that the range can actually sit flush to the wall. Right now this is too deep and it's kind of ugly anyway. So we're gonna do some surgery on this whole operation. But when we're done, there's a grounding lug in the back of this guy that we can use to attach or bond the ground, which is the reason that we failed the inspection was this metallic ring was not grounded, and this whole box can be grounded without having to deal with too much just by putting a screw in that hole in the back. I guess it's worth mentioning that one other solution to this problem would have been to locate a non-metallic box extension. We tried really hard to do that and we just struck out. It seems like this particular extension is really common in EMT and just not common in the NMT. We found something that was like maybe a 1/2 inch or something, but nothing that was deep enough to accomplish this objective. I was a little worried looking at this box the way I had it oriented when I first looked at it, because this knockout is a 1/2 inch, this knockout's a 1/2 inch, and this knockout is 1/2 inch, and I think 3/4 is the biggest knockout for this box. But because we hot knifed kind of off center over here, getting that wire to go through the middle is going to take some hot knifing and some just making a mess. But in looking more carefully at this box, there actually are orientations where the 3/4 is off to one side. So I think if we put the box this way with the 3/4 to the left, it'll work perfect. And then because these cover plates are, they have a slot in all 4 corners, they can go in any orientation, or I guess what I should say is that the box can go in any orientation and it doesn't mess up your cover plate. Metal's super popular. Everyone loves it. Gets out hammer, starts banging on things.
Beautiful.
They love it till it wakes the baby. So yeah, it's a 3/4 knockout. And I think that's what we're gonna have to make that work.
We're gonna turn the power back on to drill the concrete, because if we do something cordless, it's only gonna result in anger and take more time. Gosh. Haven't used this guy in a while.
I know.
Almost a year. Maybe more.
If you say drill concrete, there's only one tool that does the job well. Almost too easy.
Yeah.
Drill too deep. I think it might not be set to.
Or you're hitting rebar.
Hammer.
There's a lot of rebar in there.
Oh yeah. That's true. not sure why, but I took a screw. I just found like an outdoor box or an all-weather box, and I stole a screw out of it. It's definitely bigger. Kind of weird. I'm not really sure why, but it fits.
That's all you could ask for.
It's very strange. I do know that this ground wire, because this is a 50 amp outlet, it can't just be a piece of wire. It has to be a number 10 wire. So I got this from some of the leftovers that we had from another offcut of wire. And that may be why this lug is so big, is it's not for number 12 wire. Way more solid too. Oh gosh.
Bugaboo can't decide if he wants inside, outside, or to cuddle.
He's upset because the internet was off for a while.
Dad, turn him around a little.
He couldn't text his friends.
Oh, Bugaboo. Good morning.
He's on the new cat chat.
Bugaboo.
Yep, internet's going back off. You're gonna have to find something else to do. Go play with your blocks or something.
Bugaboo.
So I guess you get a huge long screw and you
Toenail.
shoot it through there or something. And now your wire is completely sucked to the surface. So I guess what we could do is hot knife there, and you could shoot a screw back into the concrete, and that would achieve the same thing. Like, they're doing it to these studs is pointless. Like, you're never gonna get there. Like, you might as well just hot knife and then drill into the concrete and put a screw into the concrete somewhere back there. So more drilling into the concrete, basically, which is fine, I guess, in this situation. So that's not that bad, I guess. I don't know why. Maybe it's the PTSD with drilling the concrete for Radiant or something like that. That just, I don't know. Drilling concrete's not fun to me. But we've got the tools to do it. And it's not, I mean, it takes just 30 seconds to drill a hole, punch a screw in there. And I guess if that satisfies code,
Good enough.
makes sense to me. I mean, it seems a little silly, but good to know. I mean, we don't have a lot of electrical to do in the garage, but yeah, that'll work. So I think we've got to do every 4.5 feet and then within 12 inches of any box that's a double gang. So we've got a dozen or so to do. Well guys, that worked pretty stinking good. In fact, this worked the best of all, bringing 2 wires out into the same electrical chase, since we now know that basically keeping these chases super tight so that the wire will stay nested in there isn't qualifying as securing. We can basically do this. It'll save us a ton of time, and then we can anchor a single screw, and since you're allowed 2 Romexes per staple, which I'm assuming this also qualifies as a staple, we can do it that way. We had been hot knifing these 2 chases thinking that this qualified as securing and that we could keep, you know, one run per chase, but this is more difficult, more time consuming, and we still have to put the securing screw in there. Don't quote me on this, but I think before we cover all this, we'll probably end up putting foam right back into these chases to bury the wire into the foam, and that'll restore the R value and complete the surface. I guess that's probably the least of all concerns, but just adds back to the R value. So I guess that's a nice thing about the foam. You can put a chase where you want, and then you can put all the insulation right back where it was before. We did put one more of those screws up here every 4.5 feet. That's what the code says. So the wall over there, the stud wall, counts as securing, which is kind of odd that this doesn't count. But anyway, so we need one along here. This is all fine. And of course, as we keep going this direction to get the outlets toward the front of the house, we now have a great method to secure things. That pretty much does it for that project. I think we'll easily pass for code on that. We've got some just in front of the boxes there. And then at this box up high over here, hopefully that meets the criteria. I'm glad we figured this out. I think if there's any one thing that's really confounded us, and we haven't even got to the SIPs yet, it's wiring into the ICFs. It's not rocket science. There's definitely a way. We just had to figure it out and kind of come up with a method that makes sense. This feels really good. The one thing that I think we're not gonna get away with avoiding is nail plates. And I'm not really sure. We're gonna have to go back to the drawing board. We have to have 1 1/4 inches of total depth from the surface. So if we can get this wire back 5/8 of an inch, and we put 5/8 inch sheetrock on the surface, then we're good. That's according to the inspector. There's a chance I misunderstood him, but if that's true, 5/8 of an inch back is no problem. I was worried we had to get 1 1/4 inches from the foam all the way back. So hopefully we'll get some leeway on that. If not, we may end up having to put nail plates over all of this stuff, which just sounds terrible. Well, that brings us down to getting the GFI breakers installed. I don't have the breakers that I need to get through our inspection, so it's going to be a pretty tight squeeze getting those from the supplier far away and getting them installed before the inspector arrives. So this one thing represents basically $800 to $900 in, we won't call it a mistake because I don't think that's true. I think we didn't know. And I think what's important to share about this GFI breaker changeout is the way we're looking at this is that we're allowed to live in our home. Gosh, I hate saying it that way. We're living in our home. And I don't like using the word allowed because it's our house. So what I'm trying to say is having a GFI breaker in your panel is a good protection for your family. And I think it makes sense. We're not looking at this in the frame of mind that the state or an inspector or somebody is requiring us to do things that we don't agree with. We're trying to take the position that we're learning here, and the electrical code requires that if you're occupying a residence, I think that's an important distinction. I don't know that this is true for commercial use, that you're in a temporary position where, like we are, you've got exposed wiring means that something could fall or a wire could get yanked out or something could happen. And while it is a massive additional expense to have GFI breakers in the panel, that once the walls are covered and the house is completed, we don't really need, the way we see that as is a insurance policy for our family and for our safety. Of course, the scenario where this would be needed is probably extremely rare, but we're taking that approach. And this is something that I think we want to convey to people who are thinking about going on a journey similar to ours, building your own home, taking it one step at a time, is that there is a provision. Can't speak to other municipalities or jurisdictions, but there's a provision to make your dwelling safe while you're under construction. And I guess when the inspector brought this up, it totally clicked in my head. I said, that makes sense, but I just didn't know it was an option. So if you're thinking about doing this, be prepared if you have electrical codes in your area, which most people do, to have to install a GFI breaker, and just be prepared to know that they're quite the investment. So this will give you somewhat of a size comparison between a GFI breaker and a non-GFI. Isn't that incredible? So all of this seems to be kind of the guts of the GFI system, and this neutral wire has to find its way onto the neutral bus. I'm glad to see that these neutral buses are pretty close. I was worried that they were up high. I couldn't really remember. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be no problem to get it hooked into the neutral bus there. But getting these hots to run around this panel, you can see that if I put all these GFIs in here and all these GFIs in here, it's going to start getting very crowded and hard to work in. Another issue that I think this may be the right time to deal with it, because everything gets so interconnected as we go, is getting all of these Romexes relocated. We ran into a problem, and this is again just not great foresight. This little tiny stud bay in here has, I think, 6 Romexes or so going through it, and a number 10 wire and also a number 8 wire. And unfortunately, there's only one way to make this code compliant in order to cover it up, and that's to steel plate that whole entire stud bay, from what I understand. And it's just not good. And I did that because I was afraid of using too many of the upper knockouts in the panel for fear that we might need those for the house. But the truth is that what I could have done is run those Romexes all the way across, come down in this stud bay where there would be plenty of room, and then come up through the bottom. Or what I think we're actually going to try is to come across and then come down into the panel. And we'll have to just reserve some of these lower knockouts, which we've already used, for other projects. But there's a lot of room in this stud bay for projects when we're coming up from the living area to come down and in the bottom of the panel. This is kind of the challenge with wiring a house as you go, especially if you're not experienced at it, is that you don't really understand how all the components relate. So I'm going to do some backtracking. I think I'm going to relocate all of these Romexes, bring them in the top of the panel, and that's going to make the panel more tidy. That's going to make this stud bay a lot more tidy, and it will keep us from having to basically create this huge nail plate to cover that stud bay. Last one for today, because we don't have the other 2 breakers that we need. But overall, I would say this is a fairly easy switch out. I'm pretty happy with the amount of room in this panel. I'm basically kind of just moving wires out of the way instead of cutting them and doing anything extravagant just in case we want to move breakers later down the road. We're not putting ourselves in a position where we can't do that. Pretty good. Well, they work, and they work. I think the important thing for the inspector, for him to feel confident about passing us for this inspection, he's not looking for us to just comply with the rules. I think he really has the goal of safety in mind. And so one of the reasons that as an inspector, sometimes we can send just a photo. If we change something and we say, hey, I changed it, see, look, it's been changed, they can look at it and save themselves a trip and save us time and waiting and stuff. But in this situation, the inspector said, no, I want to touch them. I want to push the test button myself. And that's his confidence that the breaker is doing its job, not that we've installed the breakers and we're compliant. And it feels good because when you wire this in and you don't get any faults, well, that means you're doing your job well and everything's working as it should. So everything looks really good. Unfortunately, we're still missing those 2 breakers. That means an early morning run tomorrow to the electrical house so that we can be ready for our inspection.